Hey, aloha, and welcome to another great edition of Stan Energy Man here on ThinkTech Hawaii. Stan Osserman, aka Stan Energy Man. And today's topic is a little bit different, and it's inspired by some emails I got last week that kind of highlighted some interesting things going on in the overall energy world, including the fossil fuel world, which are starting to ripple and have some effects on the clean energy and renewable energy sector. So today's topic is generation skipping technology and hydrogen. And most of you are probably pretty familiar with generation skipping technology. Primarily, I think the best known one is the cell phone. And just to give you a recap on what that concept is, we have great technology in the urban areas and stuff that were built up over the years. Like, for example, the telephone where the telephone started off as telegraphs and wires strung all over the place and operators and manual switchers that plug things in and out, and then automated switching, and then rotary dial phones, then digital dial phones, and the switching got more complicated. And then radio came along about the same time as telephones, but it was too expensive to incorporate into personal communications. But by the 1990s, early 2000s, suddenly um, the idea of radio telecom was starting to take on, and somebody came up with the idea of, hey, radios only have a certain amount of line of sight range, but if you put a bunch of different towers out there at high points, and the technology would automatically switch from your radio to a different tower seamlessly, man, you could have a pretty big network pretty quickly. And so sure enough, the cell phones literally started to make the landline obsolete. But what you found around the rest of the world, where you didn't have urban areas and you didn't have landlines and you never had telegraphs or you never had telephones, is they didn't have to go through that technology to get to the cell phone. They just found that the economics were untenable to put in long lines to small communities dispersed over large areas like the African continent to try and get point to point communication between people. And the cell phone was a whole lot better, a whole lot more capable, and actually brought in other technologies like iPads and iPhones and connected computers and started bringing the internet, not just voice communication, but cameras and internet and all videos and all kinds of things to communities that never even saw a telephone. If you showed them a telephone, they wouldn't even know what it was. We skipped the telephone technology. And what I'm finding is that's potentially starting to happen right now in a lot of places. So the tagline of my show said, a desert and an island have more in common than you think. And I found that that's really true. A couple of things are island communities and communities that are spread out, not necessarily in a desert, but in a extremely rural scenario like ranches and stuff that are maybe you'd have a couple ranches sharing a couple hundred acres, ranches that are 1,000 acres apart, and they're big, but yet the community's small. So islands are the same way. They usually have a fairly focused population, um, but they have big challenges. They have the isolation of being in the middle of the ocean. They may even have island to island issues where they've got to cross distances and things like that. They also have similar economies. A lot of times, desert or remote cultures or civilizations or communities, they have the economic challenges of having to buy their energy, usually at a premium price compared to a lot of other people in the urban scenario or the suburban scenario. And same with island nations. They have the same issues. Oceania's, the other small nations around Hawaii, 2,500 miles to our south and southwest, um, Samoa, Fiji, Federated Micronesian states, they all face the same economic kind of challenges with energy. There's necessity, I mean, if you want to be part of today's world, you need to have the technology and the energy and things like that, and it's always a challenge. But one of the most common things that I see in smaller communities is better leadership, more of a community-based leadership that's really focused on the needs of the people rather than a big profit margin for a big company. So this past week, I got a couple of interesting emails, and what made them interesting was they were talking about how in some Indian tribes throughout the American Southwest, and I'm talking different emails now, but the same subject. But these Indian tribes are starting to find that the energy that they've been used to, whether it's coal or natural gas or whatever, are starting to become too expensive or not available or unreliable as a supply chains issue. And they're beginning to worry, and what are they going to do for energy? And of course, the natural thing is they look at wind and solar and things like that, and they go, well, there's our answer. The solar panels are getting cheaper, wind's getting cheaper. Let's go with renewable energy. But renewable energy, especially intermittent renewable energy, is a challenge. And it's a challenge that Hawaii has come to grips with over the last couple of years because our legislature mandated clean energy on our grid by 2045, 100% renewable energy on our grid by 2045. So why do people oftentimes look to Hawaii, as an example? And I don't say that to boast about Hawaii just because I live here, but it's pretty amazing that Hawaii, especially when it comes to hydrogen, is kind of considered an epicenter for the United States. I mean, California is the top dog in hydrogen in our country, no doubt. The state of California has invested hundreds of millions of dollars and have a big group of people focused on hydrogen highway that Arnold Schwarzenegger started back, maybe 15 years ago. And they're really focused in California on hydrogen, renewable, clean energy, things like that. But outside of California, there's a few states in the northeast and maybe Arizona that focus some on hydrogen. And the rest of the states, I don't know if they can even spell hydrogen. It's pretty uncommon for the states or the communities to really understand much. But here in Hawaii, back in actually the 1970s and 80s, we had some pretty forward-thinking congressional members, specifically one named Spark Matsunaga. And he actually introduced the concept of hydrogen as an energy storage and energy source to the state way back then, 20 years before the 21st century. And he was, you know, not just a pioneer from a political standpoint, but he inspired a lot of people in Hawaii to think about hydrogen. And many of the folks that have come up to me in the recent history, they were inspired originally by Spark Matsunaga and the foresight that he had to use hydrogen as part of your energy system and energy economy. Now, the rest of the U.S. started, like I said, Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor of California, started the hydrogen highway in California in the early 2000s, and that was really starting to gain some momentum. But it wasn't just gaining momentum in California; it was gaining momentum across the United States, including Hawaii. And in 2006, the state legislature here passed a law that directed the state legislature to start moving Hawaii towards a hydrogen economy. And they funded a fairly extensive plan to get us there. Unfortunately, the hydrogen fund that was put together wasn't managed very well. And that created such a controversy that by the time the 2008 elections rolled around and the executive branch changed over, the governor changed over, a lot of the hydrogen initiatives just died because the legislators were so upset that the funding was mishandled or was so controversial on how it was distributed that They didn't want it. They saw it as a political football they didn't want to deal with. Another thing that most people aren't aware of is that on the federal level, President Obama, when he came into office in 2008, brought into the Department of Energy a real shining penny in the energy world, a Dr. Chu. And he was highly respected, highly regarded, very experienced in energy. Um, but he had some, I don't want to say it's probably not a good word in today's society, but prejudices. He had um, some biases, and it wasn't towards hydrogen, it was against hydrogen. And there's actually some folks that think it was all economics because he had money invested in the battery world, not the hydrogen world. So therefore, he basically um, cut back on the hydrogen funding. Not 1 year, not 2 years, not 3 years, 4 years. Pretty much every year that he was in charge of the Department of Energy, in spite of heavy congressional, you know, basically questioning his logic and his judgment on basically not getting hydrogen technology pushed forward and not getting it into the mainstream of clean energy. And it's kind of controversial. And right now, he's pretty much flip flopped and said, "Oh, hydrogen's pretty cool. I guess it'll work really great." Unfortunately, he's about a half a decade in the rearview mirror, and he killed a lot of hydrogen projects that probably by now would have gotten the whole U.S. back on track. But here in Hawaii, we actually didn't stop completely when Dr. Chu came on board. We still had several agencies and several private sector folks working on hydrogen. The University of Hawaii's Hawaii Natural Energy Institute and Mitch Ewan were doing work on hydrogen, and the team that they had at what they called High Surf on Cook Street were doing hydrogen work for the Naval Research Lab. Blue Planet Research, part of Blue Planet Foundation, or at least Hank Rogers um, funded philanthropy that was looking at clean energy and space travel and things like that. They kept on focusing on hydrogen, and of course, the organization that I used to be a part of, HCAT, which is part of the state of Hawaii economic development folks. We use federal funding from the Air Force to continue research on hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and what it would mean for the Air Force to use hydrogen fuel cells in their flight lines and maybe even in their aircraft. We kept our research going. And as a result, Hawaii actually gained and maintained a pretty strong foothold in hydrogen research, um, even in the years that it was waning under President Obama and Dr. Chu. Um, and now with Hawaii looking at the grid and being off of fossil fuels by 2045, some interesting things pop up when you have to do that. And they've actually brought hydrogen back into the forefront. So let me explain why. Number one, when you think about the two biggest areas of fossil fuel use in any locale, it's usually number one, transportation, and number two, electricity production. And it's no different here in Hawaii. But what happens when you go from fossil fuels, which can be stored in the millions of gallons in big tanks and can be basically, you can store it on ships while it's in transit. So you always have a large amount of fuel, which is basically stored energy, either on the high seas on the way to Hawaii or in big, huge storage tanks, ready to be turned into energy. But what happens when your energy no longer uses fossil fuel to generate the electricity, but uses solar panels or uses wind turbines? The sun doesn't always shine, especially at night, and the wind doesn't always blow, even here in Hawaii, where we usually have some nice brisk trade winds. So what happens when the sun doesn't shine or the wind isn't blowing? What do you do to get energy. Most renewable energy, like solar and wind, you have to use it when it's produced or you don't have it. So that means you have to have storage. And that's where we start to really see hydrogen shine because we all think of batteries as great storage, energy in to energy out. They're very efficient. We're all comfortable with battery technology, even the current lithium cobalt technology that everybody's used to in their cell phones and their portable drills and yard equipment and stuff is really slick technology, but it has its drawbacks. A, it's expensive. B, the technology comes from overseas. Cobalt, and particularly cobalt and lithium, are things that are attached to social issues like child labor and dangerous mining practices and environmental issues. So, you know, when you look at those kind of drawbacks and the fact that batteries are really expensive and they aren't really good at just storing energy, they're too expensive and they wear out after a while and have to be replaced, and that makes them doubly expensive. When you start to look at alternatives, hydrogen starts looking really good. In fact, hydrogen is about one-fourth the cost of batteries. And when you start to get into large scale electricity generation, you start to see where batteries just aren't going to hack it when you get to the multi-gigawatt level, which does a gigawatt of production constantly. So you might as well look at Hawaii as being 9 or 10 gigawatt hours worth of daily energy, or at least having reserves. And that's quite a bit to think of in batteries. The other thing that I think is kind of missed by most people is that the largest percentage of fossil fuel is used in the transportation sector. And when you think about electric cars, that electricity has to come from somewhere. So while you're trying to get your grid set up with solar and wind, exacerbating the situation is a sudden increased demand for electricity for your transportation sector. So how do you do that? And that's a subject we can talk about a little bit when we come back from the break, but there's a challenge there. But again, hydrogen is one of the big solutions. So we'll be back in 60 seconds and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So welcome back to Stan Energy Man here. We left off talking about transportation and the kind of synergy that you have between transportation and grid energy when you start to look at all intermittent renewables like solar and wind. So when you start to think about how you're going to store days or weeks of electricity, and you're going to try and get the transportation sector to be more and more electric, which, by the way, in my notes, I said get transportation back to electric. The very first transportation we had after the horse and buggy, most of the vehicles were actually electric. And people don't realize that the only reason that we didn't stay with electric vehicles was they didn't have the range because the batteries were really primitive. And if you think 75 miles or 50 miles on a small car now is bad, back then it was more like 10 miles or 12 miles. You couldn't go very far at all on the batteries of the day. And charging them was kind of a pain too. But today's modern batteries and modern technology, you're getting, 150, 200 miles, sometimes with the Tesla, 300 miles worth of range out of your transportation, but you're also hauling around some big honking batteries. And in transportation, it's all about weight. So when it comes to renewable energy, and granted, there's different kinds of renewable. Some of my favorite that I don't talk about much are hydroelectric, like the Hoover Dam. But if you're going to do that, it's tough to find a big valley that people are willing to give up, you know, and fill full of water just to make electricity. So there's in place hydroelectric, which means you can, if you have a stream that's flowing, and here in Hawaii, we have actually old sugar cane and pineapple irrigation flumes that have constant water flowing through them. We could put turbines inside those flumes and generate electricity. And we probably should be looking at that a little bit more seriously, like they do on the Big Island. And then also on the Big Island is geothermal. That's also a really awesome renewable energy because it's producing electricity 24/7, 365, and it's massive, massive electricity. Um, the folks that I work with here in Hawaii at Blue Planet and the university say that Hawaii could produce about 8 times the energy it needs for transportation and the grid just in geothermal, solar, wind, and hydroelectric. 8 times our current requirement. I'd say that's pretty darn cool, but we do have to ship it around. A lot of that electricity would be made on the Big Island from geothermal and has to get to Oahu. And you can't ship it in a big barge full of batteries, but you can ship it in liquid hydrogen. So that's something that we have to really start thinking about. So I guess one of the things that I wanted to point out is that to really meet these challenges takes a different kind of mindset. And a lot of times we think of the problem solvers in our cultures as the engineers, because you need a bridge to cross a river, or you need a building that's really tall. You look to the engineers because they're linear thinkers. They solve problems. You give them a set of parameters, they'll figure out a way to make it happen. But when you're really looking to innovation, you're looking to artists. You're looking to creative people. You're looking at people who, quote unquote, think outside the box. And that's where the term visionaries is important to me. And when I was in a military leadership position, one of the four key components of my philosophy was vision. And vision is not just to basically have an imagination of something that might happen. It's a clear picture of where you want to go and how you're going to get there. Because if you're a leader and you don't have a place you're trying to get to, and a population that you're trying to lead to that point, then you shouldn't be a leader because you have no vision. And unfortunately, I see a lot of leadership in state, federal, and local government, and even the corporate world, that lacks vision. So visionaries don't actually predict the future. It actually is a little bit of science mixed in with a lot of art, but they simply study changes occurring right now, today. And they start to do what if drills. They start to look at the second, third order effects. They start to go, well, if this happens and that happens together, what's going to happen over here? And how should we position ourselves to get there? So visionaries aren't just imaginary dreamers. They're people who take what's going on today, apply it to how they could see the future and the challenges that we have, and then try and come up with a roadmap to get there. And I think Hawaii is full of a bunch of really visionary people. And if you don't think so, think of some things that terms we use today that most people wouldn't even really think Hawaii first, but surfing the internet. Surfing is all Hawaii. Trust me, it started here. And you can't think of doing anything on the internet without thinking the term surfing. Speaking of the internet, Wikipedia. Most people think, oh, Wikipedia, that's where you look everything up. The term wiki is a Hawaiian word, uh, technically wiki, which means quick. So Wikipedia comes from a Hawaiian word. The term big kahuna, which goes on anything from pizzas to just bragging about somebody who's in charge. The shaka sign. It's amazing when you see the shaka sign. This thing you see it on NASCAR racing, you see it on professional sports, you see it all over the world, in Europe, in Asia, in the US. It's all from Hawaii. The Aloha State has Aloha shirts and Aloha Friday, and Casual Friday came from Hawaii. Hawaii is full of innovative, visionary people. And that's why I think Hawaii is one of the places that will lead the revolution to a hydrogen economy and a hydrogen future, not just for our island, but for a lot of other communities, maybe some tribes in the Southwest, maybe some other island nations here in the Pacific. So what I'd like to do to close out this section is to show a short video. You may have seen it before. It's one that we produced at HCAT several years ago. And I really enjoy it because it kind of makes that vision clear. So let's roll the video.
There are over 300 million people in our country, and the vast majority rely on large-scale, centralized power grids for their energy. But the infrastructure is aging, and it is vulnerable. Natural disasters, cyber attacks, and other threats can leave large swaths of the country without power. Fortunately, there is an alternative. A renewable energy microgrid represents a different path for the future. Renewable microgrids generate power from sources like solar, wind, hydrogen, waste-to-energy, and geothermal. That power can be stored within the localized system using technologies such as advanced batteries, hydrogen, flywheels, pumped hydro, and others. These microgrids can provide reliable and efficient energy transmission, especially to critical facilities like hospitals, airports, and military bases. Unlike our current large-scale systems, microgrids eliminate single points of failure and are therefore more resilient to disasters, threats, and power outages. Our current energy infrastructure loses a lot of money. Grid outages cost up to $33 billion annually. They are expensive to build, expand, and maintain. And they're inefficient, losing more than half of the initial energy to factors such as line loss, spinning reserves, and theft. Microgrids solve these issues and greatly reduce transmission loss and maximize efficiency. They also reduce carbon emissions and eliminate imported fuel costs, keeping money within our local economy, and even create new local industries and jobs based on clean, renewable energy. Our energy grid was built over 100 years ago, when energy needs were simple. With the increased complexities of energy demands, power sources, and transportation, now our old grids struggle to keep up. We require new ways to generate, store, and deliver energy. Renewable energy microgrids are a potential long-term solution that will provide safe, clean, reliable, and efficient energy for generations to come.
That's a great example of what I'm talking about when it comes to uh, generation skipping technology in islands and desert communities. If you can take that concept of a microgrid and take it and use it in a small community and make it work with renewable energy, and then you take that example and push it out into a large grid, but you start dissecting that large grid into microgrids that support each other, you have what I call the triple S effect. You have safe, sustainable, and survivable energy systems. They're also economical and they're secure. And here in Hawaii, we have our share of storms and other calamities, and all those three S's come in really handy, especially when you're 2,500 miles away from your nearest neighbor. That's going to do it for Stan the Energy Man today. I thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next Tuesday here on ThinkTech Hawaii. Aloha.